It's time to cut to the chase and deal with the biggest objection to the resurrection of Jesus. And it is simply that miracles probably don't happen, so why should we accept a miracle occurred in this instance? Miracles are by far the most improbable explanation, so no matter how many problems the naturalistic theories have, the resurrection will always be the most improbable. If you have seen any debates with Bart Ehrman, this is his biggest objection to the resurrection, as he explains.
What are miracles? Miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. You might think they are impossible. If you do think so, then you're going to agree with my argument even more than I'm going to agree with my argument. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. They violate the way nature naturally works. They are so highly improbable, their probability is infinitesimally remote, that we call them miracles. No one on the face of this earth can walk on lukewarm water. What are the chances that one of us can do it? Well, none of us can. So let's say the chances are 1 in 10 billion. Well, suppose somebody can. Well, then it's a chance of 1 in 10 billion. But in fact, none of us can. What about the resurrection of Jesus? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it would be a miracle. The resurrection claims are claims that not only did Jesus' body come back to life, it came back to life never to die again. That's a violation of what naturally happens. Every day, time after time, millions of times a year. What are the chances of it happening? Well, it'd be a miracle. In other words, it'd be so highly improbable that we can't account for it by natural means. A theologian may claim that it's true. And to argue with the theologian, we'd have to argue on theological grounds, because there are no historical grounds to argue on. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, the miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so, by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim, historically, that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't.
So Ehrman's biggest problem with the resurrection is it is a miracle, and by definition, the least probable thing that could happen. Therefore, we must dismiss the resurrection a priori, and it cannot be a competing theory. This is similar to Hume's argument that miracles are impossible. It basically is the same argument, except for saying that miracles are impossible, he says that miracles are improbable. Therefore, because of this, the same logic will apply, and the same problems result. As Hume said that the uniform testimony of history shows that natural laws cannot be violated, and therefore miracles are impossible, Ehrman is basically just saying that since billions of people have not been raised from the dead, they have established it probably cannot happen. Therefore, Jesus' resurrection is improbable as well. But like Hume, this is just arguing in a circle, because he has just said that the experience against them shows them to be improbable, and we can only know a resurrection is the least probable explanation if we know that they probably do not occur. So we are again, like Hume, arguing in a circle. So just switch out impossible for improbable, and Ehrman's reasoning follows the same erroneous logic Hume attempted. But we should also ask, why must a miracle be the least probable by default in all circumstances? Why do we have to presuppose this and evaluate claims with this to restrict us, and tell us how to think as we evaluate the evidence for something? What if the evidence favors the theory of resurrection has happened? Why do we have to presuppose naturalism is already probably true, and that a resurrection cannot happen? Is that really being open to the evidence and accepting the most rational conclusion? Or is it dismissing the resurrection theory because it doesn't cohere with our already determined worldview? Should we not be open to the evidence instead of trying to make it fit our already determined beliefs? Ehrman's argument is the resurrection should be dismissed outright as improbable, regardless of the evidence, because they probably don't happen. But he can only conclude this if he discounts evidence which favors a resurrection happen. It actually doesn't address the evidence. It is arguing as if his conclusion, a resurrection did not happen, is already true. But Ehrman only concludes this because resurrections have not happened on a rapid scale. Therefore, it probably didn't happen this time. This does nothing to actually evaluate the specific evidence for this event, but instead, a priori excludes any theory, however likely it is, that disagrees with your preconceived notions about how reality should work. In actuality, each claim should be judged on a case-by-case basis, and we should look at the evidence specific for that claim. Not dismiss one possibility because we a priori assume it probably cannot happen. These sweeping dismissals, whether from Hume or Ehrman, are nothing more than circular reasoning and dismissing any type of evidence that challenges their already determined worldview. As Mike Laconis says, historians should approach the data neither presupposing nor a priori excluding the possibility of God acting and raising Jesus. They should instead form and weigh hypotheses for the best explanation. Probability ought to be determined in this manner rather than by forming a definition of miracle that excludes the serious consideration of a hypothesis prior to the examination of the data. Unlike Ehrman, some do not come right out and say this, but instead will look at the evidence for the resurrection, but still judge their final conclusion, while including the prior probability and background knowledge of people rising from the dead, and say the prior probability of a resurrection happening is so low, since they don't happen regularly, that no amount of evidence can overcome that. This essentially suffers from the same circular conclusions we just went over. But if this was true, that the prior probability plays such a high role in determining how likely an event is, then we should conclude that any event in history that occurred just once never has enough evidence to back a warranted belief it happened. Why? Because if an event occurs only once, it has a low prior probability of it taking place, and therefore every event that happened just once probably did not happen, regardless of how much evidence we currently have for it actually happening. For example, take the event of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. Such an event did not happen prior, and it hasn't happened since. We don't know how Hannibal was able to do this, or even which path he took. It is actually quite miraculous that he was even able to do it without modern technology. But does the fact that no one ever completed it prior mean it did not happen with Hannibal? Of course not, and we have sufficient historical evidence that it did occur, which is even less evidence than the resurrection has, since with Hannibal, all we have is much later Roman sources. The fact that an event only happened once doesn't create a serious background knowledge problem for the actual evidence given for a single unique event, if the evidence is sufficient to account for it. In other words, background knowledge cannot be used automatically to say the evidence can never be adequate. I've argued the evidence for the resurrection can overcome the background knowledge, and there is no reason to think it cannot. Why would the background knowledge be too powerful to overcome? I see no reason why it is. Second, the background knowledge is not simply the amount of resurrections that have happened, but should also include if God exists and is able to perform miracles. If these things are true, the background knowledge for the resurrection is not as low as some have suggested. So moving on, we also need to note Ehrman's claim is also self-defeating, because he says the resurrection is a theological claim, not a historical claim. So the historian cannot say whether the resurrection is probable or not, because it is outside the scope of what the historian can say. If this is the case, he has only refuted his own argument, because now he cannot say the resurrection is improbable, because that is making a claim about the probability of the resurrection. So why is he claiming the resurrection is the least probable, when by his own words, that claim of probability cannot be made by the historian? Thus Ehrman refutes his own claim the resurrection is improbable. We can also ask why Ehrman presupposes historians cannot evaluate miracle claims. Where is this rule set in stone that historians are excluded from evaluating certain claims in history just because it might infer the existence of something beyond the natural? Ehrman makes this claim often, like it is set in stone, but never backs it up, and for good reason, because not all historians agree with Ehrman on this. David Hackett Fisher says, specific canons of historical proof are neither widely observed nor generally agreed upon. Thomas Haskell says that history, unlike English and philosophy, lacks even the possibility of defining a single canon familiar to all practitioners. Many historians, secular and Christian, feel evaluating miracle claims is perfectly acceptable, whereas others disagree. So why is Ehrman just deciding ad hoc the rules of history exclude the evaluation of miracles, when that has not been agreed upon or proven to be the case? There is no a priori reason historians have to exclude the study of miracles. Finally, Ehrman likes to try one more thing. If we are willing to say Jesus rose from the dead, based on the evidence we have, we also have to conclude other miracles in other religions have happened as well, based on the same testimony of witnesses. This is an attempt at a reductio ad absurdum, by saying if the resurrection is true, then other miracle claims also have to be true. However, this fails for several reasons. First, Christians are not outright going to reject reports of other miracles, even from other religions. Remember, we believe there are other powers at work, some good and some evil. So if other miraculous events happen, they will cohere just fine with our worldview. It is not going to create the turmoil Ehrman and other atheists who use this argument think it will. All it will do is confirm our belief there are spiritual powers at work. Second, even though there are good reasons for holding to the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, that doesn't somehow transfer credibility to other supposed miracle workers in other religions. Miracle claims are judged on a case-by-case basis, based on what evidence each claim has specific to it. Just because we grant one miracle happen, that doesn't open the floodgate. In the same way, just because some people from the Middle East are Muslims, that doesn't mean they all are. Third, many of these other miracle claims do not have nearly the amount of evidence the resurrection has, as Anthony Flew even admitted. Nothing comes close, and many of these supposed miracles have been addressed. Tim McGrew addresses several miracles Hume tried to bring up, and Mike Licona knocks down several of Ehrman's biggest examples. So many of these additional miracles can be found to be lacking in evidence, and even have contrary evidence to counteract them. Fourth and most importantly, any skeptic who tries to refute the resurrection with a reductio ad absurdum only ends up shooting themselves in the foot, because they are essentially arguing miracles can and have happened, and thus are defeating naturalism for us. If an atheist tries to argue other miracles have happened in an attempt to parody the resurrection theory, they are only going to shoot themselves in the foot and essentially agree with Christians that miracles are not only possible, but there is good evidence that they have occurred. It does nothing to make naturalistic theories look like the best explanation of the facts. Nor do these supposed parodies actually overturn the resurrection theory, because they focus on some completely other event that is still not going to show God doesn't exist and that he could not have raised Jesus from the dead. It is only going to strengthen the idea there are heavenly powers at work and can perform miracles. So if some atheists think there are good arguments for other miracles, be my guest and bring them up. It is not going to help them in arguing for a naturalistic worldview. So to conclude, Ehrman's argument is nothing more than a semantic twist on the same argument Hume employed. It is circular and does nothing to actually address the evidence for the resurrection. He should do what other skeptical historians do, which is offer a more rigorous theory for which he thinks best explains the evidence. But as we have seen, no theory can explain the evidence with the explanatory scope and power of the resurrection theory. Unless one argues from a biased position and clings to a naturalist or non-Christian worldview, there is no reason to dismiss the resurrection outright. It best explains the data, and no other theory comes close.